All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And we are just a minute or two behind schedule, so not too bad. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Chris, W2PA. Chris is an engineer and ham radio historian, and he's got a presentation for us that he calls Shutdown and Called Up. So Chris, I don't have a whole lot more of your background than that. So if you want to give us a little bit of that and then jump right in, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Dean. Good evening, everybody. And thanks again for inviting me to talk to your fantastic club here. So just as background, I've been a ham since I was 14, which was a few years ago. And I've had a long, well, mostly operate on HF and have been active pretty much the whole time. I spent a career in engineering at IBM. So I was appreciating your talk, Steve. I started out my career there in semiconductors. Today, I'm working at IBM Research on something called quantum computing, which requires a whole separate explanation. But let me just whet your appetite by telling you that a quantum computer actually uses software-defined radio. So let me also shout out to my friend Frank, W4TG, one of your members who's on here tonight. Frank and I were colleagues at IBM until he retired last month, and the stock price immediately declined. So thanks, Frank. All right, very good. So my talk is called Shutdown and Called Up. It's about the story of hams in the Great War. And in case, I think most of you know what I mean by the Great War. It's the war to end all wars. It's how they referred to the First World War before they knew there would be a second one. And it's a talk I put together for the 100th anniversary of the ARRL that I gave at the 2014 convention in Hartford. And so I'm going to take you through a narrow view of that time through the eyes of our own ham ancestors, hamcestors. And so let's start with a long time ago, 1914. It was a busy year. The war started then, but also you had Ford Motor Company announcing that they would institute an 8-hour workday, which was new at the time, and a daily wage of $5. And Charlie Chaplin made his film debut in the comedy short Making a Living. Green beer was invented and served at a club in the Bronx, New York on St. Patrick's Day. And a Belgian surgeon made the first successful non-direct blood transfusion ever. In the same year, President Woodrow Wilson signed a proclamation establishing Mother's Day. Baseball legend Babe Ruth made his major league debut with the Boston Red Sox. The Federal Reserve Bank of the United States officially opened for business. And about 100 million babies were born that year, including Alec Guinness, Jonas Salk, Alan Funt. Everybody remember Alan Funt? Jack LaLanne, Jackie Coogan, Hedy Lamarr, and Joe DiMaggio. And notice, and by the way, the only one of these people who made an important contribution to radio technology, anybody know who that was? Well, it was
Hedy Lamarr.
It was Hedy Lamarr, right?
Hedy Lamarr.
A prolific inventor and really smart lady. And of course, relevant to this talk too, the ARRL was founded and the Great War began. And QST, by the way, referred to the war in its pages as the German War. It referred to it as the recent unpleasantness or the disturbance. So the ARRL and the war would naturally become intertwined. Hams and the military were both pushing the leading edge of this new technology of radio and had been doing so for 15 years, since the days of Marconi's early experiments. In April 1914, the ARRL was first established as a spin-off of the Radio Club of Hartford, Connecticut, by well-known local businessman and engineer and prominent radio amateur Hiram Percy Maxim, who was 46 at the time. That's him at the upper left. And the Hartford Club secretary, 18-year-old Clarence Tuska. The League was organized as a service-oriented collaborative endeavor, relaying messages one station to the next as a way to extend range. So keep in mind that the best amateur stations at that time had ranges of perhaps 100 miles. But it was also to demonstrate that amateur radio was more than just a hobby, that it was worthy of occupying the ether, that is spectrum space, just like the US Navy and commercial interests. And the Navy in particular, as you'll see, played a mixed role in ham radio history. So it began with the most obvious application of wireless was communicating with ships at sea where wires could never reach. It began actually with the British Navy. Marconi had done his first experiments of note in the UK. And although a few individuals in the US Navy took an early interest beginning in the 1890s, the United States Navy at first refused to embrace radio, believe it or not, calling it too radical. Some of the senior officers even considered it an affront to their autonomy on the high seas, rejecting the very notion of receiving orders from land. In addition to message communication for ships, though, the Navy saw how radio could be used to broadcast the time and weather. Both were critical in navigation. The first regularly scheduled time broadcast began in September 1904 from a station at the Boston Navy Yard. And they had no automatic direct link between the landline feed from the time source at the Naval Observatory in Washington and the transmitter in Massachusetts. So an operator, believe it or not, had to manually keep pace with his key as he listened to the clicks from the observatory on the telephone. Later, they automated the operation out of concern for accuracy, if not, operator fatigue. But by mid-1904, the Navy had gone from nothing, having established from nothing to having established 20 coastal stations to make special broadcasts and to communicate with wireless equipped ships. So NAA, the Navy's 100 kilowatt coastal station at Arlington, Virginia, became one of the first and most widely monitored information broadcasters. And keep in mind at this time frame, the radio boom was still a good 6-7 years away. So the only people on the air was the government, some commercial firms, and by and large the hams. So NAA was the big broadcaster at the time. Hams knew it simply as Arlington. And we hams often used it as a signal reference, something to listen for to test your equipment, as well as a source for time and weather information. So at this point, the Navy, though, considered amateurs mostly a nuisance, a source of interference. And this led directly to the first radio law of 1912, before which anybody could operate anywhere. There was no radio law. But the first radio law in 1912 banished amateurs to wavelengths above 200 meters, that is higher in frequency than 200 meters, which was considered useless at the time. Most of us know the familiar story, right? It's likely, though, that Hiram Percy Maxim, having lived through the Navy's power play in radio regulation, knew that amateur radio would have to be seen as not just organized and pushing technology, but also useful to the country, specifically the Navy. At any rate, in 1915, the war was front and center. QST's first issue's lead article noted that the quote, serious national questions pertaining to defense, and predicted that radio would likely play an important, though not yet fully understood, role. And they were right. Maxim wrote letters that August. The first went to the US Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels, in which he described the ARRL and the amateurs' accomplishments in relaying messages and aiding in emergencies. Maxim offered the League's services to the government, believing that members would be valuable assets, especially since most of their stations were situated along both coastlines. So, writing with evident pride, he explained that although the League consisted of, quote, middle-aged men, young men, and boys, unquote, there were many amateur stations that were more capable than commercial ones, certainly true at the time. In reply, Daniels welcomed what he called his, quote, patriotic offer, And he directed Maxim to correspond directly with the superintendent of the Naval Radio Service, who was in charge of radio operations, including how to use non-Navy facilities if necessary. He'd be interested in as much detail as Maxim could supply. In particular, and suspiciously hinting at regulatory disputes yet to come, he expressed an interest in, as he put it, quote, the method employed for the interior control of the amateur stations constituting the League. So Maxim also wrote to the Secretary of War, a guy named Lindley Garrison, with a similar offer, but received a different kind of reply. Garrison apparently passed the letter on to one Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Reber, who was the acting chief signal officer of the Signal Corps, who thanked Maxim for his letter and then, using very formal language, said in effect, "We'll call you when and if we need you. Thank you very much." So from the beginning, hams had a sense that with their operations and their organization, they could and should contribute to the public good. Maxim summarized that, quote, the organization of our league in efficient working form is a work which is of national importance, and we may have the knowledge that it represents a patriotic and dignified effort. So in mid-February 1916, one of the first organized relay tests was run as a demonstration, primarily for the government as the audience, with everyone sharing very little spectrum at the time. Remember, 200 meters was the frequency. Cooperation was the only way to avoid QRM, which was a constant fact of life at the time, and to hear weak distance signals. So in a rare cooperative operation between an amateur group and the government, a relay test was conducted on Washington's birthday by Station 9XE at the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, and included many other stations across the country. The test's simple goal was, quote, to show the United States government that the amateurs of the United States were in a position to cooperate in radio work by, relaying single messages across the country and delivering it to various state governors, actually, and city mayors. In preparation, NAA, the station NAA I described earlier, even broadcast a warning about QRM. Comparing with another recently new technology, that is automobiles, QST noted also that a volunteer radio corps was being discussed to offer the best stations to the military for their use in national defense, and compared this to how the automobile associations in Europe were currently similarly offering their services to their governments. So such a group, the editorial said, would probably be better organized by the government than the League, which could still help getting it going by providing a list of stations and other information. Only the better stations would be selected, and that would make it a point of honor. To that end, everyone should prepare, they said, for the day when the government would be looking for good stations and make sure their own stations were in the best working order. It seemed ever more likely that the US might enter the war in Europe. Radio amateurs therefore speculated about their own role. The president had activated the National Guard, and the Signal Corps units had been particularly prominent in the call-up. One Connecticut amateur, a guy named David Moore, 1ZZ, a member of his state's unit and one of the original governors of the ARRL, related his experience in QST. He wrote, "The attitude of the government, particularly the Army, is that we amateurs are all right as far as we go, but the trouble is we're all located in the big cities where the machinery of civilization is fully developed and at hand. The telephone and the telegraph are at hand, and only in extraordinary emergencies could they see where we could be of use." So this sounds familiar, right? It sounds familiar to views you hear today about the utility of amateur radio in the age of satellites and cell phones and the internet. He went on to say that if hams were able to situate stations in remote areas with no infrastructure, they'd be exactly what the government needed, a foreshadowing of Field Day and many emergency operations to come. So at a junior encampment in Plattsburgh, New York, which later became the Army's Officer Candidate School, 3,500 servicemen from across the country were assembled that fall, including a number of hams. One of them, a guy named L.S. Summers, whose call sign was 3AFE, was relaxing along a roadside, enjoying a rest period during a long training march. And this guy began blowing CQ using a blade of grass between his thumbs, and was immediately answered by 5 other members of the H Company, 14th Regiment, who were within earshot. They formed a group that same day and would frequently get together to talk about radio. But the Army did not quite yet grasp the potential of the amateurs already embedded within its ranks, but it soon would. This QST cover depicts that, that summer junior encampment. So in February 1917, the United States officially broke off diplomatic relations with Germany, and QST opened a, quote, Department of Defense, and they meant department as in a QST, section, which they called departments, for discussing national security and defense related activities for radio amateurs. Relaying, of course, took center stage. So here you see a QST cover showing a ham relaying messages with his TR switch in his right hand and holding a message in his other hand and a completed stack impaled on a spike there on his desk. Uncle Sam looks on approvingly. A national relay system could be set up, the League said, with volunteers assigned to, say, 15-minute blocks of time twice a month, when they would commit to be on the air to handle messages in time of war. The effectiveness of this thing would depend primarily on the discipline of members in meeting their assigned on-air schedules. The idea was compared to how the French had recently been using Boy Scouts to carry messages and help their nation in other ways after it mobilized for war. It was also compared to other events from history, the runners of ancient Greece, Paul Revere's Ride, and something called the Cannonade, which I'm not sure you guys have heard of, but I hadn't. The Cannonade, as it was called, was used to announce the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825. By firing a succession of cannon along the canal's entire length and down the Hudson River, the news of its opening was carried from Buffalo to New York City in about 90 minutes. It was basically an audio frequency relay. Anyway, message handling had always been about spanning greater distances and the challenge of the game, as they called it. But now the ARRL intended to demonstrate to the government that its relay system could also be used for public good in times of crisis. QST, in fact, went so far as to assert, incorrectly it turned out, that the outcome of its relay tests that you just heard about would determine whether or not amateurs would be shut down in time of war. April QST's cover portrayed this optimism, with Uncle Sam standing there. But it was still a big question. If the country went to war, would amateurs be permitted to continue operating? So the answer came pretty quickly. That issue's editorial declared it a near certainty that if war came, amateurs would be off the air for transmitting and probably receiving also. Nevertheless, the League held out hope that certain stations that were deemed useful would be called upon to continue operating. But that would depend on the availability of operators and stations and their willingness to keep constant operations going. Think multi-operator at one station. And in any case, would probably only be allowed to receive. So for the rest of the amateurs, QST recommended making good use of the idle time by studying radio. ARRL and QST would not be closed up, or so they thought. The magazine could serve as a main vehicle for amateurs to keep in touch. This turned out to be wishful thinking, but it was natural to think this. Despite the threatened shutdown, the ARRL was poised for expansion. That was the tremendous momentum in amateur radio at the war's onset. By the 3-year anniversary of the League's founding, namely, right now in 1917, the League had grown tremendously. So a major restructuring was in the works. And normally that sort of thing would have received top billing in QST. However, the following month, the May issue, the cover declared it as the war number. A full-page announcement opposite the table of contents in that issue shouted war measure, and we are at war. Amateur wireless is at a standstill. Our stations are closed. Although the circulation was continuing to increase, the number of pages in QST would be decreased to make up for the loss of advertising revenue. So an order then from the Department of Commerce addressed to all radio experimenters was mailed to all licensed amateurs and reprinted in QST. It ordered the immediate cessation of all operation, both transmitting and receiving, as everybody feared. But it went even further to require the disabling of all equipment and lowering and disconnection of all antennas. And they enclosed a blank or a form that was to be used to indicate compliance. And it was demanded that radio amateurs return that form under threat of what they said would be rigid investigation. The QST editor, who was probably Maxim, but it was unsigned, lamented the following, quote, "Every amateur station is closed down. The lid is on and clamped tightly for a period of time, the duration of which no man knows. All amateur traffic is halted where it happened to stand. All plans for improvements are canceled. All the plans of our manufacturers are in midair. In short, the great amateur wireless advance in these United States is stopped." So stories of station closings and activities around station closing around the country also filled the news in QST. The Baltimore Radio Association, for example, reported how amateur stations had been closed and sealed across the area with the help of the club, in part to show a public face of cooperation by organized amateurs in that club. So-called sealing parties had closed more than 235 stations so far, some even in the absence of their owners, if you can believe this. All were accomplished without opposition, and some reporting, quote, humorous incidents at the club meetings. Either to report on the unevenness of government closings in other cities or to boast about their own accomplishments, the Baltimore Club claimed that no such operation had occurred in neighboring cities, for example, Washington, where closings had not yet happened, and Philadelphia, where some stations were still reportedly operating. And in Buffalo, New York, the county sheriff and deputies, along with local police, were assigned by the governor of New York to detect and dismantle amateur stations. Over 300 had been closed by mid-April. The city also set up a station in the federal building to detect and help locate any stations still in operation. After being taken over by the Navy, the local commercial station in Buffalo reopened for commercial use under Navy censorship. And a central figure in the Buffalo organization was this guy, MB West 8AEZ, who was one of the ARRL messaging relay organizers. He was referred to in QST as Radio Gunner West and as the radio censor for the United States government for this district. West had also been actively recruiting for the Navy in the local area. He had followed a rather circuitous path to get here, though. Professionally, he was involved in radio at his very early beginnings, but he then lost interest altogether because of the crudity of the equipment available at the time. But he was reintroduced to it in 1914 by, believe it or not, a group of boys who came to him for advice on setting up an amateur station. So building a station and hearing the air filled with signals, he found himself hooked. Hiram Percy Maxim, who returned in print in QST as his alter ego called the Old Man in print, returned in July writing about a club meeting he'd attended, at which an argument arose over the activities of one of the other club members who had been testing his transmitter in violation of the close down order. It turned out that that experimenter was using a so-called phantom antenna, the term they used to describe a dummy load, basically. This was evidently the old man's way of kind of putting forth a trial balloon that maybe amateurs could continue to experiment with transmitters even though they were put off the air. In fact, the QST editorial, which was probably also written by Maxim, called for experimenting with so-called phantom antennas to help improve transmitting efficiency. All of this, as I said, was probably a trial balloon of sorts to probe the boundaries of the shutdown order. So maybe seeing this editorial or the old man's article in the July in the July issue, a Navy lieutenant named Reed lieutenant commander actually, named Reed Falwell, wrote a letter to Clarence Tuska, one of the founders, making it quite clear that the operating ban encompassed all radio telegraphic experiments and strongly implied that included the use of their equipment with a phantom antenna. In his letter, he attempted to define the boundaries more precisely, saying there was no ban on the use of components like inductors, capacitors, other parts, for non-radio uses such as medical equipment, nor was there a ban on radio frequency oscillations per se, but there could be no radio telegraphic experiments at all. And all the experiments usually performed by amateurs must cease. He suggested that this would be a good time for amateurs to learn American Morse, since all good operators, as he said, should know both codes. As you know, the international Morse is what became used. And a planned September article on phantom antennas, therefore, was immediately withdrawn from publication. QST's editor, who was probably Maxim, reacted with an irritated tone, quote, "The facts are that we must not touch any radio apparatus. All we can do is read radio books and think radio thoughts until we become Germanized," he said. "We at least have these liberties." So a correspondent, a letter writer later in QST said that when war had broken out and the ban went into effect, the police in Canada took the additional step of confiscating essential parts of amateur stations. Canadian hams had reacted by actively trying to hand over comparatively worthless substitution parts, such as an old loading coil, say, to avoid confiscation, believing they would never again see their parts. So as summer approached, which was the usual period of increasing static and decreasing on-air activity, even without the ban, the QST editor, again, unsigned, but probably Maxim, noted that the volume of message traffic had nevertheless grown tremendously and been extending later into the season than ever before. In fact, before the shutdown, this was the first time that March, the month of March, had ever been the heaviest traffic month. The effects of the ban were beginning to sink in, though. He then remarked about a decline, but he then turned rather philosophical in his writing, noting how he often hears of the, quote, brotherly feeling among amateurs, and wondered why it seemed greater among hams than many other groups in society. This was really characteristic for Maxim, who was also an amateur philosopher. He wrote further that sometimes we think it's because of the deeper and more abstruse problems which we have to face. We who are closely identified in the study of radio communication are brought very close to the wonders of nature, the great laws which govern all things which we must always observe, gives one a very much deeper regard for truth than comes to those who follow only the ordinary matters of life. He continued, saying, "The fact that we are all troubled with the same things arouses a feeling of brotherhood. The fact that we appreciate one another's failures and successes brings us close together. The romance of sitting alone in a little out-of-the-way room among a lot of instruments and yet be in communication with congenial spirits in other distant and out-of-the-way little rooms is conducive to profound and reverent thoughts. The fun which bubbles over from so many of us is one of the interesting manifestations of the effect of our work upon us." He also expressed hope that amateurs would be returning soon and that this same feeling would continue even when the number of hams grew tenfold in the future, as he believed it surely would. But despite the optimism at the league, the membership was not just off the air, but leaving home for military service. QST was the only remaining medium keeping amateurs in touch, and league officials were beginning to realize that it would not last without an influx of new members and subscribers. Being of prime age, ARRL co-founder Clarence Tuska noted that he too would soon have to leave, either to join the Naval Reserve, the Naval Radio Service, or be drafted. So along with an appeal for subscriptions and renewals, the editorial page, humorously enough, called for someone, quote, "with a more or less defective anatomy," unquote, to please help continue to put out QST. But at the same time, hams were shutting down. The military had an acute and immediate need for radio operators and no time to train new ones. There was no question about what the 6,000 amateurs at the time would be doing after being put off the air. The ARRL Board of Direction responded by passing a resolution to offer the full support of the organization and its more than 3,000 members to the US government. It would provide operators and equipment, and holding out hope for some way to operate, was prepared to, quote, undertake the organization and direction of a systematic plan to eliminate the operation of secret illegal wireless plans, which would be used to supply the enemy with traitorous information, unquote. For weeks, the Navy had been also appealing for radio operators to enlist or join the reserve. Maxim was asked by the authorities actually to help recruit amateurs to man and equip coastal patrol stations, as they were called, as receiver operators. Amateurs could enroll in this service, working 6 hours per day for the duration. They would get at least $30 pay per month, about $620 today, depending on their ability. In July, the ARRL announced a drive to sign up 2,000 operators for military service. Hams could serve their country while receiving an education in their favorite pursuit. It wouldn't be all radio, the announcement said, that the training would require, quote, a small amount of drill work too, since, quote, a radio operator is a petty officer and must know how to handle men, unquote. Nearly 4,000 amateurs eventually served in World War I, contributing to the Navy's staff of radio men, which grew from just under 1,000 to nearly 7,000 by the war's end. The anticipated demand for radio equipment was also so great that the Navy asked the League whether its members would provide it with equipment for fair value. The matter would be left up to the individual members, the League said. So accordingly, the war was expected to spur significant expansion of radio-related manufacturing. And with many amateurs selling their gear to the military, there would also be a huge demand later. And amateurs anticipated a tremendous improvement in their stations when the war eventually ended. Perhaps a silver lining to the pervasive storm clouds of spring 1917. So the US Navy opened training schools across the country, including at Harvard University, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Mare Island in San Francisco. The service offered a long list of interesting subjects to be covered in its training, such as transmitting and receiving sets, condensers, oscillating circuits, and electromagnetism. And all of that, and they'd pay you too. The top end of the 5-grade scale, called chief electricians, were paid $72 a month, about $1,500 today. And at the bottom of the scale, a position called electrician's radio landsman got $32.50 per month. Interested amateurs were to clip out an enrollment form printed in QST and take it to the recruiting office, get a physical, and then send it to the ARRL for handling. And by the way, if you didn't like the idea of cutting up your QST, the League would send you a separate blank on request. 100 enlisted men per year could also take tests to be selected for admission to the Naval Academy. You just had to have passed your 17th birthday to qualify. So members began to report in with stories about their military service, being careful to include only as much detail as necessary and allowed by regulations. Many ARRL trunk line operators had by then joined up and were listed in QST, some along with their assignment locations. Besides ARRL co-founder Clarence Tuska, seen here, those serving included Ralph Matthews, who was the founder of Zenith Corporation, 9ZN, Fred Schnell, later ARRL traffic manager, Kenneth Warner, later to become ARRL general manager, Charles Service, who was later ARRL vice president, Fred Terman, who would become a noted professor and author of a group of seminal textbooks on radio engineering, and of course, maybe the most famous radio inventor next to Marconi, Edwin Armstrong. In QST, an anonymous contributor identified only as P, the letter P, wrote of his experience as a Navy receiver operator. Everything from procedures to Q signals had changed, he said, from what was familiar to him. He reported, quote, practically everything is in code. and wrote that, quote, "I have sometimes listened for 3 hours without hearing anything to disturb the absolute silence of the ether. Just think what a blessing this would have been in normal times." So Hiram Percy Maxim himself had an indirect contribution to the war other than radio, having invented the first firearm silencer and versions for engines of all sorts. And his father, Hiram Stevens Maxim, had invented the first portable machine gun, which was used to such great effect by the British Army that he was knighted by Queen Victoria. So amateurs continued to report their early wartime experiences. A guy named Bill Woods, 9HS, operated from Manistee, Michigan at WMX, another commercial station that was taken over by the Navy. In his letter to QST, which included a redacted word or two, by the way, he described his midnight to 6 a.m. shift, listening to the goings on with no QRM at all, amazingly. When he and other amateurs reported to the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, NAJ, they initially were kind of discouraged because they found that very few there seemed to even know what radio was. But over time, they discovered a few others with similar backgrounds in ham radio and prepared to have a regular ham fest, as they called it, one of the first uses of that term, with fellow amateurs. Regular NAG confabs, as they call it, also took place among old amateur radio friends, the radio bugs, as they call themselves. They would often gather after work and talk well into the evening until the bugler blew taps. Some of the most enjoyed moments of his life, he wrote, were spent at this training camp. A group of them then, answering a call for volunteers for Class 2C duty, headed to Cambridge, Massachusetts and the Naval Reserve School, where they met many more operators who had come in from all districts of the country. A guy named Walter Maines reported in from the naval radio station San Francisco that, quote, "Our Pacific Coast friends are doing their bit." They nightly were able to copy KHK, which was a 5 kilowatt, 600 meter spark station in Waihawa, territory of Hawaii, nearly 2,100 miles away in the middle of the Pacific, and buried in a sea of summer static. About twice weekly, they also were able to copy a station called JOC on the 600 meter spark from Japan, 5,475 miles distant, along with some ships off the Japanese coast. Daytime receptions were limited to about 500 to 750 miles. Their station out there on the West Coast was yet another private one taken over by the government for receiving work only. It was built by their chief operator, who was originally an amateur operator who had built it for his own amateur station prior to the war breaking out. His antenna was 400 feet long, suspended 45 feet over poor sandy ground near the ocean in West San Francisco, with the station on the second floor of their building. And not to be outdone by the Navy in its active and visible appeal to amateurs, the Army called for aviators and balloon pilots for the Signal Officers Reserve Corps of the Army, offering a commission to a second lieutenant, a salary of $2,000 per year, or which would be about $41,000 today, and a bonus when called to active service. So the summer station closings and restrictions, while it was disheartening to us hams, were just one indication of the strategic and very tactical importance of radio to the government and the military. And therefore, it was something to be closely guarded. This guy, Jonathan Zenneck, was a well-known German electronics professor and widely recognized radio authority at the time. He'd written a best-selling textbook on radio theory that was regularly advertised at QST. In July, he was arrested and interned at Ellis Island on suspicion of helping German spies in the United States receive communication via high-powered stations in Germany, such as the well-known one in Nauen. His arrest seemed to have been ordered, in part at least, because basically, he was German and a well-known radio expert, because there were as yet no real reports of actual spying by him. However, Zenneck was also a captain of the Marines in the German Army and was assigned to a coastal station in Sayville on Long Island, New York, pictured here. which was owned and operated by Atlantic Communication Company, itself owned by Telefunken of Germany. So the US Navy had taken over this station in 1915 to enforce what was then the United States' neutrality in the conflict. But as the country entered the war, though, Zenik and his station were both put under the control of the Navy and the Secret Service. Incidentally, Zenik would go on later to contribute to cathode ray tube development, by the way, and received the IEEE Medal of Honor in 1928. So in response to all this in QST, the old man, as he called himself, his alter ego, Maxim, wrote an article he entitled "Something Rotten Somewhere," meaning out in Sayville, Long Island, speculating that Zenik's arrest must have been based on something concrete after all. A New Jersey amateur, it turned out, had recorded transmissions from Sayville and worked with the Secret Service to build a case against the station before the Navy took over. The old man wondered, could it have been Zenik who, sent this information about our first troop shipments? He also wondered about something appearing in the press about something called superimposed oscillatory circuits, some sort of encoding that made transmission undetectable, purportedly, without proper information to extract them. Could this be some new solution to the QRM problem, he wondered. And then, magnanimously, he suggested that, quote, after we make up again with old Z, meaning Zenik, let's ask him into the ARRL. He's probably okay. His trouble is with his Kaiser. So the old man went further to argue that if only the Navy would let the stay-at-home amateurs use their receivers, they could help locate such enemy transmissions. In September, an editorial agreed, saying the secret operation by the enemy was possible using any number of clandestine antennas, and that amateurs with receiving capability could be of great use in discovering them, if only they were not prohibited from doing so. There was one instance, unfortunate, that happened in Philadelphia. A guy named James Nassau, 3CT, call sign, was investigated by special officers of the local police and the US Secret Service, actually, because someone in his neighborhood, knowing he had been an amateur, reported suspicious noises coming from his house. Imagine the following. Late one evening, inspectors, who were not at all familiar with wireless at all, really, technically, one of them, in fact, admitting he had never before seen a wireless, appeared at his door and asked whether he, quote, could receive on his setup and about how far he could send, and where his setup was simply a hand key and a buzzer that he had been using for code practice sessions with some friends. The rest of it, his equipment had long since been packed away in boxes. So this is the kind of thing that was going on at the time. So September QST cover drawing depicted a submarine at sea flying kind of an improbable looking multi-wire aerial. So as a metaphor, but really relevant, as hams left their silent submerged stations behind to cross the ocean and serve as signalmen. And by the way, the idea wasn't all that improbable as it looked. There were actually several submarines using radio at that point. It was cumbersome. Other September editorials lamented the coming of fall and the yearly promise of lower static, prime season for radio in normal times. Were it not for the closings, the amateurs would have been gearing up right about then. And yet this optimistic passage appeared in the issue, most likely written by Maxim. It probably will be, he wrote, it will probably be many months, and we expect to see at least another September come and go, which will not be much different. 'Tis a sad, sad tale, but like most sad tales, it is not without a big ray of hope. This hope is that the present conditions cannot go on forever, and that the spirit of amateur wireless is just as much alive in these dead days as it ever was. Whether the law closes up our stations or even takes away our apparatus, whether we ourselves are scattered to the four winds of heaven, whether we are in the army in France or the Navy on the tossing seas, we are still amateur wireless bugs, and nothing will ever change us. Dead Septembers may come and go, and the years may change us from springy youth to sober age, but the call of the spark will still be in our hearts, and the desire to have and use the little old set up in the attic or down in the cellar will still be the one great yearning. We will always be amateur wireless bugs, come what may. Isn't that right, fellows? So equally upbeat, the editors predicted a new kind of game once amateurs were again permitted to operate, and 1,000 or more new operators trained by the Navy would return and become active. Quote, "You will be big guns," they wrote. One of the first uses of that term that I've seen. "When you come home after the war, you will be the ones who will run things." But nowhere in the issue is there any indication that this would be the last QST to be published for the next 19 long months. So as amateur stations fell silent, the airways continued to carry commercial and military signals, many coming from the fingertips of former radio amateurs. But despite their contributions, there were some in government who still sought to limit or eliminate the use of wireless by private individuals. Fast forward now, a year or two later, as the battle ceased in Europe, amateur radio came under renewed attack at home. Bills introduced in both houses of Congress shortly after the armistice in late 1918 sought to turn control of all use of radio over to the Secretary of the Navy, who with others had been trying to do exactly that for quite a long time. Maxim personally appealed to the sponsors of one bill, successfully obtaining an exemption for amateur radio stations. This was kind of an indicator of his influence at the time. At a congressional hearing, the League accepted at face value the Navy's assertion that it did not want to kill amateur radio. But now at the war's end, their attitude had clearly changed. A new bill would indeed have had just that effect, close them down. The League did not protest the Navy ownership issue, only the specific provision eliminating amateur radio. With QST out of print, the ARRL took the steps to send out what they called little blue cards to all licensed amateurs, alerting them to the new threat and asking for support. To cover the cases where an amateur was away from home, deployed with the military, and there were very many of those, the cards were addressed to, quote, any member of the family of the amateur. The response that they got to this may have or probably exceeded even Maxim's expectations. The letters and telegrams poured into Washington in opposition to these bills, sent by the amateurs and their families, including those of hams killed in the war. The League's board of directions sent Maxim to Washington to testify before a hearing of the Committee on Merchant Marine and Fisheries, which was the body in charge of the House bill. Several prominent clubs also attended to speak in opposition, and that bill never made it out of committee. So several years later, Clinton DeSoto, who some of you might be familiar with, he's the author of the ARRL history book called 200 Meters and Down. He took note of what an extraordinary thing this really was. A well-backed bill had been defeated at a time when there were no amateurs on the air whatsoever, and radio as a hobby no longer existed. And this stood in stark contrast with what had happened in 1912, when there were thousands of individuals involved in amateur radio, and yet a law was passed imposing severe restrictions on them. The difference lay in strong organization on a nationwide scale. So with barely $33 in the Treasury, the ARRL board began to meet again in the spring of 1919 and got to work reorganizing. So that included, new constitutions, electing officers, putting a plan to finance starting up again. And but the abrupt end of amateur operations was reflected in kind by equally abrupt end to QST a few months later, a victim of its expired subscriptions and canceled contracts with advertisers. Ironically, the magazine's own success in recruiting amateurs to enlist in the military had resulted in a lack of amateurs left to support it. So all ARRL memberships expired during the war, along with all amateur licenses. So at a meeting in New York on March 29, a group, including Maxim and Tuska and 9 others, decided to donate $100, roughly $1,500 today, necessary to publish what they called a midget issue of QST, shown here, as a first step in building support to get a journal back into its pre-war form. That issue that you see right here emerged as the American Radio Relay League Special Bulletin, only 8 pages long, with the stated purpose of getting together again. It was folded in thirds like a business letter, closed with a seal, and mailed with a 1-cent stamp. One of those 8 pages was written by the old man. Surprised by a telegram from the editor, he wondered if it could mean the end of these wireless-less days was coming at last. His code was rusty, his grasp of technical details was rusty. How his equipment would have fared during all the storage and all this time. Everything was rotten rusty, he said. So Maxim himself explained how the restart would be paid for. With the war over, the board of directors anticipated that an influx of amateurs in much greater numbers than before it started, having all been trained in radio by the government, would be a dividend of their earlier recruiting effort. So on Saturday, April 12th, to the delight of amateurs, the Navy unexpectedly announced the lifting of the ban on receiving that would be in effect 3 days later. The ARRL headquarters was immediately flooded with telegrams. The editors noted that the news caused an electrical impulse, as they said, to instantly pervade the entire country. It was like the news of the armistice. It seemed to fill the breasts of thousands of us with a wireless enthusiasm that had not been experienced for many a long day. Spring had sprung and the wireless bugs were coming out of hibernation, as depicted in this QST cartoon you see. QST officially returned in June, billing the issue as the reopening number. It still had no cover. Its main headline, Maxim announced that the ban on receiving had been lifted and that the Navy indicated that transmitting would be allowed soon, as the president declared the end of the Great World War. The ARRL extended the hand of good fellowship, as they said, to amateurs, member or not. The magazine was back to its familiar format with 36 pages for July. It reported that the ARRL was halfway to its financing objective. This clever cover art you see here by a guy named Clyde Darr, 8ZZ, shows an operator in Navy uniform sitting at the controls of a station that's clearly not his, the only on-air activity really for hams in 1919. By contrast, the small inset at the lower right shows a house with aerials, the home and station he left in 1917. Ham's lives had changed dramatically in just 2 years, and it all stemmed from their passion for wireless and its relevance to the war effort. Despite the political and regulatory control disputes, though, between amateurs and the US Navy, the Navy well understood how much it had benefited from all the trained amateurs ready to volunteer for service during the war and the likelihood of needing them again someday. So in August, the Navy announced it would begin broadcasting test messages containing weather information and text for code copying practice from NAJ, the Great Lakes Station, as they put it, in order to maintain the interest of the radio amateurs and keep them in operating practices. Ralph Matthews, who had served in the Navy during the war and was now ARRL vice president, he was the founder of Zenith, remember, cited the historically tense relationship in his reply, quote, "The average amateur has always been a little afraid of the Navy, partly because he was not as well acquainted with it as he might have been, and partly because it was not as well acquainted with him and his uses as it could have been." But the Navy's inaction was speaking louder than its words, as they had not yet done anything to reopen amateur stations. So after getting its hopes up for a planned August 1 lifting, the Navy declared the lid would not come off after all until the president had officially declared a state of peace. Of course, such a declaration would also mean the Navy would no longer be entitled to control the amateurs anyway. So as Kenneth Warner wrote in QST, in other words, the Navy can let us start anytime now, but refuses to do so unless they can no longer prevent it. And he speculated that amateurs may have to wait even longer for the Senate to ratify the president's declaration. Meanwhile, the Department of Commerce outlined its policy for amateur radio after the resumption of operation. First of all licenses had expired and everyone will have to be retested, this time at an increased code speed of 10 words per minute instead of 5. Number 2, a separate application for a station license must follow the construction of a station. But expecting a flood of new applications, the department would allow operation to begin upon simply submitting a station license application. And number 3, call letters would be issued from scratch. Old ones no longer existed, and it would not be possible to get them back. But later, in contradiction, they stated that if someone wanted his old call, he could apply for it, and if it remained unused, could wait until that call came up in sequence, believe it or not. It wasn't quite clear who would do the waiting. So as fall arrived, fully 10 months after the armistice, the mounting impatience led ARRL to investigate the lack of action in Washington. They discovered there was more to the issue than simply waiting for official peace to break out. There was yet another proposed bill, one authorizing the Navy to use its stations for commercial purposes. At the same time, the Navy Secretary Daniels, who you see in this photo, wrote to both houses of Congress asking them to further consider establishing a commission to study, quote, the radio problems, and authorized the president to define wavelength bands for different classes of work, give the Navy a monopoly over ship-to-shore and intercontinental radio, and authorize the Navy to use its stations commercially and assist companies in developing radio. The ARRL expressed its alarm that there was no mention of amateur radio at all in this exchange, still distrusting the Navy because of its previous attempts to eliminate amateur radio. And since the reopening was being delayed personally by Secretary Daniels, with no stated reason, the League suspected that they wanted to push through a bill before losing control. Meanwhile, there was still no lifting of the transmitting ban. So Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, assured the League that he would personally radio Secretary Daniels about it. Not telephone, not telegraph or write to him, mind you, but radio him. And amateurs might hope to know their status soon. Across the border in Canada, the ban had already been lifted months earlier on May 1st, and lots of activity was starting up north. Why were we not back on the air in the US was the question. According to an October QST editorial entitled, quote, Daniels only knows, was the answer to why hams in the US were not yet opened up and back on the air. So they continued to take jabs at Secretary Daniels, even the old man in the person of Maxim. So finally, nearly 1 year after the armistice, a breakthrough finally happened. A single tacked on page after the end cover of October QST, a hastily added special announcement proclaimed, ban off. The job is done and the ARRL did it. See next QST for details. The League headquarters staff had to scramble really to add this single page to the issue because the news arrived just at press time. So it would now take some hard work to get everything and everyone back up and running. And ARRL Secretary Kenneth Warner noted in this issue that the days of real sport are at last with us, he said, directing readers, come on fellows, and get back into the air again. So the QST cover drawing for the November issue shows this joyous ham bursting from the top of a can, popping off the lid, which you can see at the top here, says the lid, in case there was any doubt. He clutches a copy of QST in one hand and a certificate, maybe his new license, in the other. The issue started out with Maxim writing on the importance of organization, citing both the establishment of the League and radio clubs as prime examples. Only by having a national organization were hams really able to influence the government on the one hand by preventing legislation that threatened amateurs' very existence, and on the other assist it by providing wartime operators on very short notice. He wrote, it was a noble effort for all concerned and lifted amateur radio from the realm of toyland to the dignity of a valuable national asset. Amateurs had also received help from friends in Congress, in particular this man, William Stedman Green, a 78-year-old chairman of the House Committee on the Merchant Marine and Fisheries, representative from Massachusetts and, quote, loyal protector of amateur rights, was credited with the successful reopening. Green had been the one who introduced the resolution on the League's behalf, asking the Navy to supply a reason for the continuing ban. When he received no reply, he introduced Joint Resolution 217, directing the Secretary of the Navy to remove the restrictions immediately. So getting back on the air, though, meant everyone had to be relicensed. Though some had unexpired commercial licenses, which the government would count as an operator license, everybody had to get new station licenses because they had all expired. The first directory of calls appeared in the December issue, listing only a few new first district call stations, apparently the only ones reporting new licenses at that point. Among those were the Harvard Radio Club, 1AF, the MIT Radio Club, 1AN, and Maxim himself, 1AW, his new call, and Tusca, 1AY. And by the way, Ralph Matthews, 9ZN, who got his old call back. So on the air, things were still very quiet, even though the winter was coming on, the prime radio season. The solar cycle had peaked around 1917, just in time for hams to miss it because of the shutdown. The Atlantic Division manager reported hearing mostly silence on the first night of reopening and only a few locals. The activity returned gradually, though, as everybody worked to connect equipment and erect antennas. Licensed or not, amateurs had refrained from reassembling their station before the reopening, maybe due to uncertainty about when it would occur, given the long delay, and maybe because they stuck to the letter of the law that prohibited even assembling a station during the shutdown. So work on using undamped waves, as CW is called, for amateur use began in earnest only after vacuum tubes were made available after the war, because they had been improved and made cheaper by the war effort. So those advancements finally made it practical and affordable for hams to use vacuum tubes, and that spelled doom for Spark radio. The vacuum tube was the only device capable of producing CW. ARRL Secretary Warner wrote, quote, "To put this in the simplest terms possible, with vacuum tube transmission, all our energy is concentrated on as near one wavelength as possible by any known method." So the greater efficiency promised to allow distant communication with much lower power than Spark and much less QRM. So hams returned from the war in greater numbers than before, many newcomers having been trained by the military, and they had lots of stories to tell at club meetings, as depicted in this QST cartoon. And of course, many did not return. The In Memoriam column in QST appeared right after opening and ran for a few issues, predating the Silent Keys column that continues to today and carried some of their names. So that's the story, guys. The story of hams in World War I, rather. And just a thanks, shout out to my friends K1DG and K1RT and W2SQ, all of whom own complete collections of QST that going back to the beginning, and were kind enough to make some photos and scans that I used in this presentation. And if you've got more interest in early ham radio history, you can check out my website, w2pa.net, where there's a lot of other stories, including, by the way, the story of the first transatlantic tests, which we're about to celebrate the 100th anniversary of, coming up in December of this year. So thanks very much. I hope it was interesting to you guys, and happy to answer questions.
Oh, fantastic, Chris! What a tremendous effort in that presentation, and really informative and really interesting. I learned a lot. I've actually I run our one of the net controls for our Monday night 2-meter net, and I have used your site in the past to gather my trivia questions for the net, and we'll use it again in the future. I am going to turn this over to questions, but we are over time for our official meeting time. So I'm actually going to officially close the meeting and thank everybody for their participation. And what we normally do at the end of the meeting, in any case, is we stay on for kind of informal powwow. And so I'm sure there are many questions for you, Chris. So And thank you very, very much, Chris. This was absolutely fantastic. And so with that, I'd like to formally close the meeting of the Vienna Wireless Society, and we are open the Zoom chat to all the Q&A and conversation that we would like.